Um, so the first question, we're going to do an interactive portion, so you don't have to yell or anything. We're just going to raise our hands. Do you guys have drought management plans already that you've, one of you, couple of you? Okay. Um, so that's, I think, the big thing that I'm hopefully going to kind of get you thinking about, just like Jeff was talking about, when to make those decisions, or even just some things to think about as we continue to move on through the drought. And hopefully we get some, some much needed moisture, but we all know how the weather tends to help us out a lot of times. So it was funny because like 2 years ago, I think I was in Malta talking about they had too much moisture. All they had was moldy hay and everything. And then 2 years later, I'm talking about, well, what do you do when you don't have any hay and no pasture or anything? So um, Jeff covered a lot on the range production side of things. We've talked a lot about precipitation, and it's kind of one of those meetings that I'm not sure if there's a real good positive way to promote everything. But one thing to think about is if you do have lease agreements, anything like that, make sure that there are some drought clauses in there. If you need to pull off early or you need to get somebody off your range early, that you have those kind of, I want to say, outs in your lease agreement, so you don't overgraze those pastures, as Jeff was talking about. You can overgraze to a point, but at what point then do you start beginning to cause those negative impacts? Look at what resources you have available. Can you get feed ingredients in that where maybe you can start looking at supplementing with not only hay, but maybe some different grain sources? Should you be considering early weaning? But like Jeff said, there's a lot of different labor impacts there, as well as facility impacts. Where should we start our culling procedures? And then what kind of recovery options are available? Hopefully once we start to get some moisture. Now, I'm going to say this out loud, and you'll probably all kick me because all I can think about is that drought of 2017 leading into the worst winter we'd seen in how many years. And I'm really hoping we don't go into that winter again. But to be honest, it brought some moisture. But how long does that recovery take? And so all of your decisions you're making this year, like Jeff was saying, or even over the winter, will impact now a couple years down the road. And one thing I would like to point out, we all liked the winter because it was nice and open, it was fairly warm. We didn't have a lot of snow and a lot of those, 40 below days, but a lot of producers leaving animals out on the same pasture for months on end. They basically weaned and they stayed on the very same pasture all the way through. Yes, they might have gotten some feed, but I think sometimes we take for granted that, okay, it's an open winter, they can kind of go out and pick and graze. But that's not really helping our cows a lot of times either, is meeting those requirements, getting them ready for calving. So there are some things, maybe some of those pastures were overgrazed a little bit, and how are those going to recover with our lack of moisture, and how long is it going to take those pastures to recover? So just a few things. I'm just going to kind of walk through some months here, but and Jeff had pointed out quite a few of these things, but one thing, we're already almost to May 1st. So there is something to think about with water quality and quantity. Do you have normal water reservoirs or any sort of tanks or anything like that typically dry up no matter what during later parts of the year, or when it gets a little bit dry out? You may want to start thinking about altering your rotations to use those water sources first versus waiting until they're gone, and then you're trying to either haul water or to alter your grazing plan then to utilize other water sources. Like Jeff talked about, we'll just kind of skip over a little bit of that forage production because Jeff covered that quite a bit. The next one being, if we do see a lot of this limitation in our pasture growth, what sort of additional feeds are available and how much is it going to cost to feed those additional supplements? I know Hay's going to talk a lot about hay, hay quality and some nitrate issues, so we won't go into that too much. But if you can, and you're going to not have enough pasture out there, purchase feed now before we get into the middle of the drought and everything gets even more expensive. Like grain prices right now are already starting to rise. Corn prices, they've been historically cheap about the last 5 or 6 years. But they are starting to rise this year. And I'm not saying they went from $3 a bushel to like $20, but it went, we're up around that $4 to $5 a bushel now, for corn. Evaluate your alfalfa and all your other forage, harvested forage type stands. What can you use as an alternative grazing type situation when you run out of pasture? So that's April. May, basically the same things. We're still looking at it, your delayed forage production and inventory any carryover feed that you might have from this past winter that you didn't have to feed, any additional hays you might have. Now, typically, if we're talking hay, I recommend to have a 2-year hay supply on hand because you never know when we're going to get into that situation where we're going to have to start feeding some of that older forage. That's the good thing about our beef cows. They don't need the high quality 20% alfalfa protein for them. Even a lower quality 7-8% grass hay is adequate to meet their requirements, especially during the summer months. So you can utilize some of those lower quality forages for our beef cows and, potentially then save your higher quality hays for a time when their requirements are at their highest. June, still we might, we might see that reduced forage production again. But then also, this is probably a good time to really start thinking about destocking. What can you call? Can we start to wean early? Do you have any open cows out there that you're just kind of hanging on to, trying to rebreed if they lost a calf or anything like that? Looking at a lot of your grazing situations. Once again, we're still looking for additional feeds and that water quality and quantity. So this just kind of continues through July. The same thing. This is where we really probably want to start talking about culling. If we don't get enough moisture to have any sort of average even type forage growth, how do we reduce those stocking rates? And then the water quality and quantity again, and then those additional feeds where we're going to really have to start considering what we're going to supplement for our cows if we're going to try and keep some around. Like Jeff said, well, that's been 4 years ago now. I guess we're all I still suffer a little bit from when the winter and the drought and everything. Every time it gets to be cold or we start to not see any moisture, I just think back and, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? I know the summer of 2017, I saw a lot of thin cows out there, a lot of breeding issues. And Carla's going to talk more about how drought and some of those things are going to affect your rebreeding rates and your conception rates. But the big thing is, we want to maintain those cows' condition, maintain their nutrition, if at all possible. So we're still moving through. Hopefully we'll get some moisture, but making these decisions now, having that drought plan written down, like Jeff was saying, if we only get 15% of our, if we're 15% below average or 25% below average, what are these thresholds that you're going to want to decide on to help your operation continue on into next year? Hopefully we don't get to the point where we're selling entire herds for the summer, but it is a possibility, and it is something probably to consider if this drought continues to be severe as it is. So like I said, the forage production, it's not going to recover as quickly because we don't have that soil moisture in the ground. Carbohydrate storage is probably minimal, especially for those overgrazed pastures from the previous fall. And then if you can, like Jeff said, delay turnout is if you can, even for a couple of weeks to allow growth. In that summer of 2017, actually, I wouldn't even say it's summer, late spring, middle of May, I went out with Mike Schultz, the Custer County agent, to a producer, and he had turned out his cows because we'd gotten a little bit of moisture, and he just wanted to get them out of the lot so they wouldn't be in there and, let everything dry out, because he'd had his 100 cows in a dry lot area feeding them hay to calve, and he turned them out on pasture with green growth about 1 inch tall, and those cows never came back to hay. He started losing a lot of body condition. Those calves started to go downhill, get sick, and everything, just because those cows actually limited themselves on nutrients. They preferred the really short, high quality pasture versus the good quality hay he had for them. So he actually had to bring everybody back in and lock them up so they could only eat the good quality hay. So there are some things to think about. Just, if we do see some green up out there, make sure that there's enough out there that those cows can consume what they need. So just to give you an idea, put this up here just as a requirement standpoint. So this data is out of Oregon, but very similar, just on the quality standpoint. Let's see if I can make this work here. So try not to get out of the way of the microphone too much. So at about 10%, that's our post-calving, early lactation requirement. That's a protein requirement for the entire diet for our cows. The middle line is about 9%. That's our pre-calving crude protein requirement. And then about 8% nutrient density for our mid-gestation cows. So those cows without calves at side, they don't have that lactation requirement. That's the lowest they're going to be all year, but typically we don't think about that until September, October time range. But on a year, if this continues, we could see these low quality forages much sooner than that early July time period. So we're going to want to start thinking about maybe some different supplementation strategies, as well as this also kind of assumes that they're able to go out and eat everything they want every day. And we all know that forage production is going to be limiting during the drought, so they probably are going to be limited in that forage capacity. Therefore, their requirements are going to be struggled to be met by some of these even lower quality forages. So to give you an idea, on a dry matter basis, cows over average for the entire year will eat about 2% of their body weight every day. So a 1,400-pound cow, 28 pounds of dry matter each day. When they're in early lactation, they'll increase that to about 2.2% of body weight. When they're dry or late lactation, when they're really starting to kick that calf off, we're talking about 1.8% of their body weight. So if we think about that in terms of even the dry matter, it's about 5 pounds difference between those two. And then if we do it on an as-fed, roughly still about that 5-6 pounds difference. Doesn't seem like a lot for one cow. But you put it over 100 days, it's about a 500-pound difference. Over 100 cows, that's quite a bit of difference there. That's an 18% reduction or so of their intake on a daily basis just by removing that calf from their side. So we'll go into a little bit of early weaning and when we can start, when I typically recommend pulling those calves off if you're going to consider it. But also, once that calf gets a functioning rumen, kind of in that mid to late summer time frame, they're going to start eating grass too. So you have to account for that calf consumption as well. So, they can also eat quite a bit of forage as they grow and we get into that September, October time frame. They're out there, most likely that cow really isn't having anything to do with those calves. They're ready to kick them off and be done. They may not sound like that at actual weaning time when they actually bawl and cry and everything, but most likely during the day, they don't want anything to do with that calf anymore. So, like I said, for that low quality forage, right around average for the year, about 2% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. Now, if we can get to this growing pasture when it's nice, lush, and green, it's extremely palatable, it's extremely digestible. That's when the lovely green comes out the back end, and you better not be standing within about 10 feet of them. We can be up in that 2.5 to 3% of their body weight every day. So we're just increasing that forage intake as long as that forage is nice, lush, and green. So you have to account for that in their intake. So we can see a huge intake of that pasture during those months. And if we don't get a lot of moisture, we got to worry about forage quantity out there and making sure those cows can stay full and meet those requirements. So we'll go into early weaning here just a little bit. So, the one question, how early can you wean? Like Jeff said, I typically don't recommend anything early than like 60 to 80 days. There's been some research that you can go younger than that and be more like a dairy calf. I don't recommend it. That's a lot of extra management time you got to put in. Even 80-day-old calves, extremely hard to keep those calves in a fence. They are fence crawlers, and so unless you have some sheep fence somewhere where that's really sturdy, you can struggle. You can put them in a dry lot, then you got to deal with fencing there. Usually they'll find a way to crawl through that fence in a feedlot situation. But also then quite a bit more illness just because of the dust factor. Those calves just haven't fully developed their rumen, their immune system. And so they're still a young animal out there, and they're still relying on that cow. So a lot of extra management has to go into early weaning. Now it can be done successful. I know producers that do it at 80 days, but they also have their own facilities and dry lots to take the calves to and have that management system. So it's pretty intensive. So those are some considerations you need to think about if you're going to consider early. Where are you going to go with the calves? Because most cattle buyers probably aren't going to want to purchase 80-day-old calves. So they need to go somewhere where they can grow. You can get them built up to that 400 to 500 pounds and sell them as a weaned calf. Another one, economic feasibility. What's it going to cost you to put those calves in the feedlot if you've got to pay somebody to do it? Dry lot cost, usually 35 to 40 cents per head per day. Then factor in, your extra medications, your vaccination program, things like that, any additional, the additional feed costs. So you're probably talking close to that, $1 per head per day if you can get a pretty cheap ration going. So there are some things to consider there. And this is my one, Carla walked out, so I can talk about repro a little bit. It's my one repro slide where they did look at early weaning calves at 80 days versus a normal conventional 200-day weaning program. And so basically all this data is showing that those calves that were weaned early versus a conventional wean, there weren't any differences in overall pregnancy rates or anything like that. The biggest difference they saw was actually in that body condition and body weight. The early cows were able to gain more body condition and body weight back by the time normal weaning occurred, just because they didn't have that lactation requirement anymore. That lactation requirement was removed, which is the highest requirements they'll be at. They were able to go back on pasture, consume their forage, and increase their body weight. Now, as long as they can maintain and they're in good body condition, we don't think about it too much. But these girls went from a 5 to a 6 basically, compared to that normal cow or that conventional weaned cow. So there's about a 1 body condition score difference there. So those cows were a little bit better conditioned going into the winter, and they held that improved body condition through the year, through that winter time and into the subsequent year. So that is one good thing about early weaning. And this was on the natural service side. The next year they did AI pregnancy, where once again they really didn't see any differences. So you can see those early weaned cows are, this is all I got, Carla. These are like my 2 repro slides, I swear. But once again, they held that extra body weight, they held that extra body condition to help those cows through that winter time where they rely on that body condition in those winter months for the cold weather. So looking at the heifers and steers from that calf growth, so the conventional weaned steers and heifers versus the early weaned. So aged early weaning was roughly 80 days. Those heifer calves and the steer calves pretty much weighed the same, right around that 250, 270 pounds. But where we saw the increase was that body weight at normal or the 200-day weaning time, because those early weaned calves, they had to go somewhere. So they went into a dry lot, got a really good nutrient-dense diet. They adapted well to the bunk. And so they gained a lot more body weight just because they were on a higher plane of nutrition. So I just threw some rough math here. This is just rough, just to give you an idea that, yeah, you can probably get a little bit better price for those smaller calves, but are they really going to be worth the more money? I didn't do all of that. This is just if everybody paid you $1.50. So those early weaned calves are actually worth more money at the end. You just have to figure out if that difference of about $50 between those 2 types is going to overcome the cost you would have had in the feedlot versus leaving them out on pasture. Now, you can leave your early weaned calves out on pasture. They're going to struggle. They haven't really learned to consume that grass yet. They're still learning from the cow on what to eat. Plus, you got to stop them from crawling through the fence and finding the cow. So you might want to put them quite a ways away where you can actually monitor it, or have a really good, strong sheep fence. Or you tell your friends with sheep, you say, I'm going to put my calves in your sheep corral you can sell your sheep. Don't tell the sheep folks that I said that. So, so there are some different things you can think about when early weaning. There's just a lot of considerations you gotta determine if it's going to be economically viable for your operation. Some advantages: you can reduce cow nutrient requirements. You're removing that lactation requirement. You're going to increase their body condition. You're going to reduce that forage demand on that pasture. Plus, then you can market any of your cull cows early. If you already have a list of cows to go to the sale barn, you can get rid of them a lot earlier than holding them till October when you're going to conventional wean, and then sell them with everybody else in the market. You can also have improved calf growth just because of that higher quality of diet. Some additional, those additional disadvantages, though, you got a lot of labor and a lot of input costs for those early weaned calves, just because you got to stop the fence crawlers. You got to provide additional feed, additional vaccines. If you want to put them on an implant program, that's going to cost some money as well. Plus, those calves have increased nutrient demand, so you're feeding them more. And then that, like I said, that health vaccination program, plus then any additional illness you might see because of that extra stress those calves might be under. So we'll go through a little bit of supplements here, but one thing I do like to say, like if you called me up and said, Megan, I got some cows I need to feed, what can I do? So here's some questions I'm going to ask you about your cattle. I'm not trying to pry all this information, but it does help me get a better accurate picture of what kind of program we need to put them on. So what are you feeding? Are you trying to feed your bulls? Are you trying to feed your mature cows versus your heifers? How long are you looking to feed them? What do they look like? Are they good body condition, good body weight? Where are they reproductively? Are we looking for extra weight gain? A lot of times our heifers, we're still asking them to grow after they calve their first time, because they don't normally reach their mature weight till they're 5 years of age. So we need to get them to 5 years to get maximum production out of those heifers. So we're still asking them to grow. When are you going to breed those heifers? And then probably the couple most important is what do you want to feed that we can get? Have you done a nutrient analysis? I always recommend a nutrient analysis on no matter what kind of feed you're going to look at. But there are some things like corn, pretty similar across the board, that I can use some book values for. But if you have different forages available and you're looking to supplement with, I'm probably going to ask you to, send in a nutrient analysis if possible. It's fairly cheap. You can send it in $12 to get you a full nutrient analysis on the forage you want to look at, and I can get you a better, more accurate picture of that. Now I throw vitamins and minerals down here on the bottom, or a little bit separate, I should say, just because I more just want to know that you have them on a vitamin and mineral program. I recommend one all year round, no matter what the year. I know it's expensive, and this is usually the first thing that gets cut when feed costs rise, or we end up in a drought where we got to manage our input costs. I don't recommend cutting your vitamin and mineral program. This mineral program, I consider it an insurance policy. It's not tomorrow. If you run out, they're going to be deficient. But if you stop feeding it for a lengthy period of time, you can see some deficiency issues. Plus, a lot of those vitamins and minerals are used to mitigate stress. So during a drought situation is an extremely long period of stress, and we can start to see some deficiency problems. So some of the alternative feeds we'll go through here, just to keep in mind. Nutrient analysis is important for those just because they can be pretty variable, especially like if you're going to work with the sugar beet factory here and get some like beet pulp. Getting that analysis done can be pretty critical to determine is the product going to be really dry? Is it going to be extremely wet? And how are we going to manage for that? And then, right, what's it going to cost, and is it available? So just to run you through some rough math here for any sort of supplement. Doesn't even have to be on a drought year. It can just be on a regular year. If you're at let's say the feed store and you're comparing two different ingredients, and the feed guy's trying to sell you something, sorry, Ty. Look at it on a cost per pound of nutrient basis, and you can then compare those two supplements, or if you got some hay sitting at home and you know what you would sell it for, what you would purchase it for. So this hay, for this example, $160 a ton. These are all kind of just made up numbers. This isn't, perfect math. 13% protein, about 55% energy. And then we have a supplement, like let's just say a commercial cakes type supplement. It's $350 a ton. It's about 20% protein and about 65% TDN. Now, one thing to think about is on a feed tag for a supplement, they do not provide you an energy content for the most part. Never understood why, to be honest, because it is pretty important. We want to make sure we're going to meet our energy requirements. So if it's a higher grain type supplement, I usually estimate in that 65 to 70% TDN range. If it's a higher protein supplement, we can get into those 28, 30% proteins. I'm going to estimate it a little lower at about 60% TDN. We can send it off, get you an accurate estimate of that TDN, but this is just kind of a rough estimate for what I usually do if you're looking at a supplement. So everything's on a price per ton. So use my little finger here. So we take our percentages as a decimal, multiply it by 2,000 pounds, and in that hay we have 258 pounds of protein and about 1,100 pounds of energy. The supplement has about 400 pounds of protein and about 1,300 pounds of energy. Then take the price divided by the pound of nutrient, and we get our price per pound of nutrient here. So if we look at this, okay, the hay doesn't look too bad. Okay, 62 cents per pound of protein, 15 cents per pound of energy, 88 cents per pound of protein, or about 27 cents per pound of energy for the supplement. So it doesn't look too bad for the hay. Now, the next part is, well, what's that cost you on a per cow basis? So if we got to feed cows, it's kind of hard to stop rolling out a bale a third of the way through and limit them to an amount. So, at that point, you're feeding, let's say for a bale, 10 pounds per head. So we can multiply by the percentages again and get the pounds of nutrient in each allotment of feed we are going to put out there. So for the 10 pounds of hay, it's about 1.3 pounds of protein and about 5.5 pounds of energy. For the supplement, let's just say it's a cake, it recommends 2 pounds per head per day. So we're going to be about 0.4 of a pound per pound of protein, and about 1 1/3 pounds of energy. So if we do that on a price per head, that hay is quite a bit more expensive at 80 cents, or for the supplement at 35 cents per head per day. But the biggest question is this 2 pounds of supplement enough to help us meet those requirements? So that's where you have to make some adjustments and determine if that's enough. For the hay, most likely you aren't going to have to feed anything extra. For the supplement, if you already have enough forage out there, that might be enough for you to feed just the 2 pounds. So if we look at our requirements for a 1,400 pound cow, we need, because right now we're right at post-calving. 6 to 8 weeks is about how long that post-calving phase happens, where lactation peaks and then starts to decline. So they need overall 20.5 pounds of energy and 3.5 pounds of protein just to meet their general maintenance requirements. That is not including any sort of additional body condition that you might need to add. So can those supplements help you make them? Yes. But is that enough to push them to meet those requirements if we're limiting in some of our forage quality out there and quantity? So, we're going to go back to that 2% of body weight a day just to get us a rough estimate. Pasture during the winter months, 5% protein about, and about 50% energy. Could be lower quality than that. So 28 pounds by our percentages gets you about 1.4 pounds of protein and about 14 pounds of energy. So we're pretty close, actually, for post-calving and even, early and mid-gestation, not post-calving. I was thinking pre-calving. Thought I had boxes, my bad. So for post-calving, like right now, we're short about 2 pounds of protein for those cows and about 6.5 pounds of energy. So how are we going to make up that shortfall versus early to mid gestation? We're over in energy and we're only slightly under in mid gestation, or in protein. So they can probably make up that little bit of shortfall of protein during that time frame if quantity is available out there. So this is my one push for high school algebra. We're going to solve for x. This is as most complicated as I get. So if we're looking at post-calving and early and mid-gestation, and feeding that hay, how much of it are we going to have to feed to make up those shortfalls that we had? So, you know, we need X pounds by a 13% or so hay, and we need 2.1 pounds of protein. Solve for X, and we get about 16 pounds of hay is needed during the post-calving time of that hay to meet those requirements. Now, I solved for TDN as well just to see, but protein's the most limiting nutrient, so we have to feed over that 12 pounds needed for energy to make up that shortfall. In early to mid gestation, we only need a couple pounds of hay. If there's quantity of forage available out there, they can probably make up that 0.2 of a pound or so that was short. That they were short, and we were going to overfeed the TDN as well on that one. So just some things to consider when you're looking at different supplements. You can figure out how much you're going to have to feed of these by doing some algebra, I know, and solving for X, but looking at it this way can help you decide what might be the most economical way to do that. Because we can look at that hay and say, okay, we're going to feed it. I changed the price on this, even though it's the same numbers, I changed the price here. But about 50% for that protein on this example, and about 11 cents for that energy. But if we look at it on a cost per head basis, you know, it's about $1 to feed them during post-calving and only about 10 cents per head per day during mid-gestation, which I know is a little hard to go out there and roll out only 2 pounds of hay per head. So stop about a third of the way through the bale and gets us a little bit difficult to do, but you can do some of these and see if they are economically viable for you. Just a little bit about urea here. So the biggest thing with urea, it's extremely nitrogen dense. It's 281% nitrogen, which is the makeup of our protein. So crude protein is the percent nitrogen in whatever feed you're feeding times 6.25. Urea is all nitrogen. However, it's only available in the rumen. It does not pass through to the intestine. So it can be good if you have a very limited protein in your feeds, but we can only feed so much of it. Otherwise, we can see some ammonia toxicity issues because there's not enough energy to break down that urea as soon as it hits the rumen. So we want to feed this in something more of a TMR. Some of your supplements will have urea in them, but it's fairly limiting because we need to make sure they have enough energy to break down the urea from ammonia. Most of your tags will say something like percent crude protein from, or protein equivalent from NPN, which is a urea, or it could be biuret, things like that. They're non-protein nitrogens. They're not a natural protein. So you need to look at that and see how much urea is actually in the supplement. And it's just the percent of protein from the non-protein nitrogen divided by 281, which is the percent of nitrogen in urea, times 100. So if your tag says 36% equivalent protein from NPN, 36 divided by 281 is about 13% urea. Those higher urea supplements or feeding extra urea is usually done more in our feedlot industry, just because they have that additional grain source in there to help them break down the ammonia. Whereas more of our grass and forage supplements are 2 to 6% or so equivalent, and that's usually less than 1%. So just a few things about urea. Like I said, it's based on a urea fermentation potential. Higher grain is a positive urea fermentation potential. Negative is your forage base, just because those forages aren't digested quick enough to provide that energy to the microbes in the rumen to break down the urea. So using those starches like corn and wheat can help break down the urea more efficiently. However, molasses is too fast. So, because that's immediately hydrolyzed in the rumen as well, and so having that grain source. But the biggest thing, you don't want urea toxicity. So uniform mixing if you're feeding a TMR or total mixed ration, and feeding it consistently. Typically, you start out with more of a plant-based protein, your soybean meals, things like that. And after about a month of getting them on a higher protein diet, you can then start working your urea into the diet. You don't want to feed a urea type supplement to your newly arrived cattle if you have any sort of especially early weaned calves. We typically don't recommend feeding it to anything under 450 pounds. And if you already have a high protein ration going, urea really isn't going to help you that much. Above 12 to 13% protein, urea really isn't giving you a big bang for your buck. So we'll just kind of go through alternative feeds real quick here. So a lot of these are available here, but you want to adapt them to it, figure out what's most economical. Are we going to meet nutrient demands with them? And how easy is it to use and store? And Hayes will go through some more nitrate things, so I'm just briefly mentioning nitrates. For some of our alternative feeds, such as like corn residue, corn is a nitrate accumulator, so those stalks, if they're going to start eating those stalks, definitely get a nitrate test done. And I know Tim probably has, do you do the strip test, Tim? Right. So Tim does both the quick test and the strip test. The strip test allows you to get a quantitative measure of an at least approximation of nitrates within your forages. The quick test is just telling you whether or not the nitrates are there or not. But corn residue is actually pretty common grazing in the Midwest area, just because they can turn cows out on the husk and leaf are actually fairly decent protein and energy. Once they get into the stalks and that's all that's left, they struggle a little bit just because of that. It's really bulky and it's not very palatable. Corn, however, is fairly low in protein, so we're probably going to want to consider potential protein supplements. Now, you can feed straw. You can mix it with a higher quality forage. If you're gonna feed straw, make sure it's not the majority of the portion of the diet. We want to limit it to about 50%. And that's mainly because it's extremely bulky and they can't digest it very well, but it will fill that rumen up. But we need to feed that medium-ish quality, so about that 8 to 10% protein hay with it, just to keep that rumen functioning, keep everything moving, because you can see some blockages occurring. For those cows, 50% of the diet through the second trimester. Once we get to the third trimester, we'll want to start lessening that to about a quarter of the diet, 25%, just because there's just not enough rumen capacity left with that fetus growing. Heifers can also consume straw, about quarter of the diet, just because they're growing, and so they need a much higher quality diet and more nutrient dense than our cows. Field peas, I know in 2017 there was a lot of producers turning out onto their unharvested peas just because they were about 4 inches tall. They can be grazed. They're actually a really good protein and energy type source. And if you do harvest them and maybe can't get them sold, you can feed those rolling and breaking that seed coat with most of our grains can really help digestion. Field pea residue can be grazed, just like wheat stubble. We do see, though, that the pea residue can actually degrade quite a bit faster in the field than most of our other residues, but it can be grazed and for at least a decent protein and energy. We can feed wheat. However, it's highly fermentable in the diet, so we typically limit wheat in the diet to about 20 to 30%, just because it's highly fermentable and we cause some acidosis problems. The fines especially can cause acidosis, so even leaving those kernels whole, they will get a really good energy and protein out of that wheat. Wheat midds, pretty common alternative feed here in eastern Montana. I would say good protein, good energy, used in a lot of our commercial supplements. However, pretty high in phosphorus, and so we just want to make sure our calcium to phosphorus ratio, so making sure we're making that up with our mineral or any sort of supplement we feed, we want to make sure we have a good calcium to phosphorus balance. The reason it's limiting in finishing diets is just because that energy really isn't high enough. It's more of a fibrous energy versus a starch grain energy, and so they just aren't as efficient as utilizing it for growth versus like a corn or even just a straight wheat. So just a few slides here on water quality. So the reason I talk a lot about water quality is because we don't think about it a lot, right? Water's there. They drink it, they keep going. We don't think about it a whole lot, but it's the most important nutrient that you can give your animals because water quality drives intake. So water quality will drive your dry matter intake because as soon as that water quality goes down and quantity goes down, they'll stop eating or they'll reduce their feed intake because there isn't enough water. So we need water also for nutrient transport, lactation, basically all of our processes for these cows. And so having that good water quality source can really help drive production. And that's why, if we think about drought, if you have sources that dry up later in the season, even on a normal year, you may want to think about using those pastures first and then rotating back through to some of your more sustainable water sources that last through the entire summer. So a lot of things impact water as you would think. So lactation, how hot it is, how warm the water is in the wintertime. We've done some work at Fort Keogh where if you have warm water, they will drink more water versus that is just cold out in a tank. Our side of the state, salt and sulfur are the biggest factors for our water quality. And that's mainly because it puts them off the water, but also because the sulfur especially can tie up our trace minerals, and so we can run into some deficiency problems there, or even some sulfur toxicity issues. Iron, the blue-green algae or other bacteria, and then obviously all of these affect odor and taste, which can affect water intake. Now, the blue-green algae, that's that paint scum-looking water grown algae, not the fibrous green stuff that you can just reach in and rip out. So we can't really get rid of blue-green algae. They've done some work with some copper sulfate and it can help. However, blue-green algae is toxic to both animals and humans. So if you ever see paint scum that looks like paint scum on top of the water, don't drink it, don't go into it, don't let your pets in it, don't let cattle into it. It's a cyanobacteria and causes those toxins, and very, very small amounts can cause death. So if you're curious about your water, if you've noticed you've had some issues, that you notice maybe some of your animals aren't hitting some of your water sources and they're moving to a different water source, you can send off a water suitability test. It is fairly expensive, but you do get a range of factors back, such as total dissolved solids, sodium, calcium, sulfur, nitrates, pH, iron, and conductivity. So TDS, or total dissolved solids, are basically all the dissolved salts in your water. And this is something you can go on Amazon and order a TDS meter. They're 10 to 15 bucks, and this allows you to test your water before turn-in, and you can see if it's going to be toxic or not, or at least put them off the water source or not. You can also get things for bacteria, but we have noticed that these water sources fluctuate throughout the year, and honestly, it's a little bit counterintuitive than what you would think. You would think, okay, as water evaporates and we get later in the summer and you notice some of your reservoirs are drying up, you would think all these toxic nutrients or even just salts in general are being accumulated in the water. What we've noticed actually when the huge influx of these nutrients occurs is actually a rain event where it washes everything down from the sides that have dried. So we can see huge spikes in sulfur and TDS right after a rain event. So that is something to keep in mind. So I always find this slide a little bit amusing because who has 1,100-pound cows? No? Oh, okay. This was developed back in the 80s, and they have not changed it or updated it to represent our larger framed cows now. So average cow size in the United States right now is 1,350. A little bit bigger than 1,100 pounds. And I also find it a little bit ironic that for lactating cows, it is everybody. Heifers, everything is all one. But look at the gallons of water they need to consume every day. So we're doubling their water requirement during lactation versus just during gestation and late gestation. So all of our animals require a lot of water for that lactation requirement. So that's why that water quality and quantity is really important. So just to kind of run through just a little bit of how TDS and sulfates can impact everything. So basically, if you send me a water test, anything below about 5,000 parts per million, I'm probably going to say you're just fine. You might see some of your naive cattle, like if you went to the sale barn, you bought them from, I don't know where, let's say Missoula. I doubt you guys do that, but let's just say you do. They don't run into the water quality problems we run into here, so they might be put off a little bit even at that 5,000 part per million mark. Above 5,000 part per million, I'm probably going to caution you a little bit and say, well, we may want to really look and see what the sulfate is and what the salt content is, just because we could see some problems. Now, that doesn't mean if you have had cows on your place for 40 years and you've just continued to propagate your genetics, cows adapt. They will adapt to high TDS water. It's the naive cows we really worry about. Now, if it gets into the 10,000 part per million range, I'm probably going to say we might not want to let them drink that. So there is something, we can adapt cows to some poor water quality. Now, sulfates, this is probably the most concern I have on the eastern side of the state here, is the sulfate problem. Just because we do run into even lower sulfate containing water causing some deficiency issues or some sulfur toxicity issues, even in cows that may have been on your place quite a bit. Where we can run into it is we can see sulfur toxicity, but we can also tie up our trace minerals. It doesn't allow some of our trace minerals to be absorbed in the rumen, such as copper, zinc, manganese, and selenium, which are all extremely important in reproduction and growth. So once we get above I'd say about 2,000 to 2,500 parts per million, I'm really going to be concerned about the sulfate content in the water, because I'm just going to want to make sure we're on a really good quality mineral program and we're providing additional copper, zinc, and manganese for our cows. Like I said, the reason is because that sulfur toxicity it's an antagonist for those trace minerals, and also the formation of thiamine within the rumen. So sometimes when you get a polio case or polioencephalomalacia, or you might call it blind staggers, thiamine might be able to help you overcome the sulfur toxicity. It may not. It actually just depends on how that sulfur is interacting in the rumen. But mainly what's occurring is those cows are eructating hydrogen sulfide gas. They're inhaling it and causing those polio problems. They get disoriented. You'll see them head pressing in a corner. And I would say it was probably the spring of 2018, right after the drought, there were people calling with sulfur toxicity issues in water that they had never seen sulfur problems in before. So it can occur because our water quality does fluctuate during the year as well as between years. So we'll just run through some data real quick here. So this is liver copper concentration of steers. Trey Patterson did this while he was at SDSU. So they looked at just the copper concentrations in the liver with different water qualities of TDS or sulfate. So on the left is strictly TDS, so, not even really extremely high levels of TDS. This line, try and get over here. This line here at about 30 to 35 parts per million, that's where we consider our cows deficient in copper. So as you can see, even as the blue lines are our initial, red lines are our final. And so as you can see, even though they really aren't extremely toxic levels of TDS, we did see a reduction in our copper storage of those steers. On the right here is the TDS. On the left, after the slash is the sulfate concentration. So we are getting extremely, where I wouldn't even consider letting my cows drink it up here in that 2,900 to 4,600 parts per million sulfur. We saw a drastic reduction in those steer liver copper concentrations. So, and they did run into some polio issues, some increased illness and some increased mortality from that increased sulfate concentration. Now, I wish I could stand here and tell you like, oh, sulfate is 60% of TDS. It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. You could have 10,000 part per million TDS, so extremely toxic that way, but your sulfates could be 100. Or you could have 3,000 parts per million TDS and 3,000 of it will be sulfate. So it's highly variable. There is no set percentage. I wish there was. It'd make it a lot easier to make recommendations. So just water nitrates. So if you do have high nitrate feed, you'll want to watch your nitrate concentration in your water sources. Typically more in your runoff areas, field runoff or feedlot runoffs and things like that is where we typically consider our nitrates. But even at low levels, nitrates can be extremely toxic in the water just because they're already solubilized. Once they hit that rumen, extremely volatile, hydrolyzed immediately. So those harmful algal blooms, like I said, blue-green algae is our main concern, cyanobacteria. And then it kind of appears like that latex paint, any sort of pea soup. So, this bottom right picture here is that kind of scum layer on the top. That's that blue-green algae. You can't really dip anything in and scoop it out. There's been a little bit of success with copper sulfide for treating some of our water sources. And it's been kind of hit or miss, I would say. It's not an exact science, so you may or may not see some issues. But we do see these in drought years where those waters are non-flowing, pretty stagnant. You can see some blue-green algae, and unfortunately, there really, even once they dry out, there really isn't a way to clean that area and get it removed for the next year. Now, just the last few slides here on selective culling. So Jeff talked a little bit, you've got to establish your production goals. Hopefully you have those established, whether it's reproduction, genetics, or performance. But I think the biggest thing is to sit down and really look at your herd and where you want to go in the future and making that assessment. Be very critical of your own herd. I know that's difficult. Just like I know we all have our favorite cow that you love. This might be the year if she's 1,700 pounds and she gives you a 300-pound calf at weaning every year. That might be the year to consider getting rid of her. I'm sorry, but I know we all got it the favorites, but keeping that cull priority list, if you write it during calving season in your calving book that she ate your lunch and she came after you, and then this might also be the year for that. Big teats, bad feet, all these things are probably some years to really look critically and decide where you're going to go with your herd. Making that cull priority list, cows, heifers, and if you keep steers sometimes, might not be the best year for it. But if you do have some multiple outlets for those cows, making those decisions early and getting them into those programs can help make some more money. So like I said, production issues is a good way to start. Who calved and lost the calf? Who aborted? Did you have some that had low quality calves or just turned up open all of a sudden? The bad feet, bad udder, thin cows, any cows that are late bred. But then we get into that kind of gray area, difficult to define because it's so dependent on what your goals are, such as efficiency. So that could be pounds calf weaned per cow body weight. That could be forage efficiency, which cows are eating out of house and home and still aren't producing for you. That kind of goes back to as well, you know, you have your 1,800 pound cow and your 300-pound calf that you weaned in October last year. Those are some critical decisions you need to make. Like Jeff also mentioned genetics. Do you keep your young animals, which require a lot more maintenance, a lot more feed to keep them growing, or do you get rid of the old animals because you want to propagate those new genetics? Another thing, not all heifers are destined to be breeding heifers. Some are destined to go to market and be a feedlot animal. Making those decisions early can really help cut down your numbers. Know quite a few people that are already looking, they're not even going to keep heifers this year. They're just selling everything. They're going to breed and go because they just can't keep those heifers around because of the drought. The best thing you can do, though, is making those cull cow decisions early. So this is about 9 years of data here. The biggest dip in the market is usually in that October, November, December timeframe when everybody's selling their cull cows because they've just preg checked, they've just weaned, and they're trying to get them on the truck. Now, if you can hold them, if you got that feed, you can hold them till after the first of the year. You're usually going to get a better price for those cows. Versus if you can sell them early, you can get a better price for those cows. Now this year, though, when I was looking at numbers, when I had this in a talk back in, I think, January, cull cow prices actually never dipped this last year. I don't know why. A lot of guys were picking them up and they were basically going to feed them out in a dry lot, put some weight on them, resell them for a higher price. They were honestly averaged between 55 and 60 cents. So we didn't see a huge drop in our cull cow prices this year. Now I'm guessing we probably will, or I shouldn't say this year, last year. We probably will this year just because nobody can really do anything with them because we don't have a lot of feed out there for them. So that's all I have.